Hey everybody, Captain Logan, recording this one on my own for the Geekvolution Omnibus. I'm rebranding Read a Book to Read or We're All Gonna Die, because the read a book title I was using to encourage people to read books who don't usually read books or aren't reading often enough, but it is such an urgent matter, and there are so few people reading for fun these days and missing out on some absolutely wonderful stories in prose that I want to really up the ante, and we're calling it now Read or We're All Gonna Die, which is a quote that Eric and I were laughing a lot about when we reviewed Monster Squad. So anyway, today I want to take a look at the Autobiography of James T. Kirk, a book that came out last year and that I read over the last couple of weeks. And actually, I read this over the last month. I finished this a couple of weeks ago, so it's not super fresh in my mind, but I'm going to give you just a quick overview and let you know what I thought of this and if you should pick it up, of course. This is written by David A. Goodman, who is a TV writer. He worked on Family Guy a lot, and he worked on a little bit of Enterprise, but was kind of pushed out of that show and had a hard time getting much script writing work on that show when he was even on staff, and you can read about that in the 50-year mission, which was published for the 50th anniversary and is the oral history of Star Trek. He wrote a book several years ago that is intended to be the first 150 years of the of Starfleet and the Federation, and this is another history like that that's supposed to be kind of a primary source piece, pretending like it is a nonfiction work written by someone who lived the events that it's talking about, and this one, of course, written under the guise of James T. Kirk. I think his voice for Kirk is okay. That's not necessarily the strongest thing about the work. It's a very reserved kind of Kirk. It doesn't necessarily read the way you might expect to. There's not a lot of bombast. It doesn't read like if William Shatner wrote this book as Captain Kirk, which is probably a good thing. It's like I said, it's kind of reserved. It's kind of understated, which is how I would expect Kirk to actually probably write a book like this. It's real humble and it's very vulnerable. Much of this is honestly, it takes on a pretty tragic tone and is a lot about regrets that Captain Kirk has, and he points to, Goodman points to a whole lot of places in the series where we might question Kirk's morality, and it might be, thrown under the rug just a little bit in the episode, and Kirk is actually, struggling with his decisions, particularly in episodes like Court Martial and certain things he does and feelings he has in episodes like, of course, Sitting on the Edge of Forever and Obsession and episodes like that. But my favorite part of this book is actually the beginning, is the early days of Kirk before and through his going to the Academy, and that's the most informative stuff. Not that this is canonical, of course, and you kind of have to take the canon with a grain of salt. Also, I should say that Goodman takes some creative license, sometimes that I really appreciate and sometimes where I think he goes a smidge too far, but some of that creative license is what makes it really entertaining to read, too, because Goodman is really tongue-in-cheek about the things in Star Trek that don't quite line up, where he does his level best to find ways to make things work together that really kind of don't, and he takes everything as canon that was on screen, of course, regardless of whether or not it actually really lines up, especially things from Enterprise. And some of my favorite moments in this book are Kirk going back to things in Enterprise that inform the 23rd century, and Goodman finds really creative ways to match those things up. The one exception to that rule, and this will be a minor spoiler, is that Star Trek V is not canon, and I talked about that I won't actually relay that story here because I want you to read it for yourself if you're interested in this book. I talked about what exactly it was in the Search for Spock commentary, so if you want to hear about that, you can listen to that commentary, but I won't spoil it here. But there's a really fun place where Kirk is studying something that happens in Enterprise and is trying to figure it out and doesn't think it makes sense, and it's absolutely wonderful. There's a lot of connective tissue where suddenly the original series feels much more organic, and you can see why Kirk makes certain choices, especially for things like moving around personnel in between episodes, and it takes the episodes in production order, I think, as opposed to aired order. Well, most certainly because Where No Man Has Gone Before happens before Mantrap, and you'll see pieces again of connective tissue in between episodes where it's like, this is why Kirk replaced the first Doctor as opposed to when he brought in McCoy, and these are the characters who died in Where No Man Has Gone Before and were replaced with certain characters that you see after that, and here's his thought process and why he feels that way. One of the biggest things I got from this book, one of my biggest takeaways, is how wonderful Conscience of the King is. And that's an episode I've seen a couple times and was not super familiar with, and never thought of as either one of the really important formative episodes for Kirk or one of the best episodes of that series. And after reading the section in this about Conscience of the King, I went and watched that episode again, and I had a completely different viewing experience with it, because I didn't... So much of the background that's done for Kirk in that episode is really subtle, and I didn't pick up on the fact that, and like, this is obvious now looking back on it, but it never occurred to me that Kirk was a child during the events with Kodos the Executioner. Kodos, who, by the way, and I know I'm not the only person to have recognized this, but I noticed it on my own before I heard anybody else talk about it. It was a fun thing to realize. Kodos is a lot like Infinity War Thanos in that there is a planet that is where all the people are starving and there's not enough food to go around, and if he kills half the population, the rest of the population can survive, and so he does it basically by casting lots. And Kirk is there as a kid when that happens, and the book it suggests that that was a really important formative experience that leads Kirk to the kind of leadership skills he has and to the drive and determination to become a starship captain and innately wanting to help people. So there's like two really important experiences early on in Kirk's life that lead him to that, and one making him want adventure and also wanting to help people, but the other making him realize how cold and cruel the galaxy can be regardless of how utopian Earth is supposed to be. And that the other thing that happens to him is earlier when he finds a Tellarite captain who crashes in a ship and saves him, and that really puts the kind of the bug in him to want to help people and to think that he can that he has something to contribute to the galaxy, and that if he goes on adventures, he will probably make it and survive and prevail. And as it goes along, and when we get into the 5-year mission, Kirk begins to, as he says, this is his words in the book, that he starts to buy his own press, and that's where the notion of the no-win scenario comes from, or excuse me, that there is no such thing as the no-win scenario. And of course, he goes into the Kobayashi Maru and all of that, and you start to really see, again, the vulnerability in the man, and you see that he's, of course, not, and we get this in a lot of Star Trek, but the curtain is peeled even farther back, and I feel like I have a much better sense of the man. Like, it feels like a research project where Goodman has looked at all of Star Trek with Kirk in it, and like kind of brought things to the forefront that are there and inform Kirk, and kind of make it all organic and create this picture that I never really had of the man. And that is absolutely wonderful. A little surprised by some of the episodes that are not included in the original series section, which is really only about a third of the book. And he goes into the 5-year mission, and he talks about specific episodes. It's weird that he doesn't really even brush past particular episodes that he doesn't talk about a whole lot. Like, there are certain episodes I was surprised weren't included. Like, I don't think he even brings up what are little girls made of, although he might, and I'm just forgetting that. But there are certain episodes, like Bread and Circuses, which actually is brought up later but doesn't come up during the 5-year mission section proper. And it kind of just feels like a list of major events in the original series, but almost as if they're the only ones that happen. And I found that a little bit odd. It was sort of like, and then this happens, and then this happens, and there's, again, a lot of good connective tissue and a lot of stories that end up reading as foreshadowing to other stories, which is fun because sometimes that wasn't really intentional in the show, but he finds ways to make it look like that in this. Oh, one thing that was really strange is that Shore Leave is never brought up, even though Finnegan is a prominent character at the Academy who, as we know from Shore Leave, is constantly messing with Kirk and making his life kind of hell at the Academy and making it hard for him to advance, even though he ends up, of course, prevailing there too and becomes the youngest captain of Starfleet, which the book makes a big deal out of and talks about kind of why that happens. But there are questions that you might have watching the original series and the movies that this book clears up, like why does Khan know who Chekhov is? That's always a big plot hole that people make fun of from Wrath of Khan. There's a pretty good explanation for that in this. And I'll come out and just say this. There's a wedding for Khan and Marla MacGyver's on the ship, which is great because we know that they're supposed to be married, but it's not really an official marriage because they married, on the planet. I kind of like that Kirk conducts this ceremony. I think that's really cool. And there are so many cool references to Trek canon going all the way through. So even though this is obviously just about the pre-TOS, TOS in the movies, there's a whole lot of really cool... Goodman finds a lot of really cool ways to connect it to other Star Trek things, like I said, stuff with Enterprise, but also Morgan Bateson is a character in it. Kelsey Grammer from the end of Cause and Effect from TNG, and it's really cool how he utilizes that character, and he actually shows up a couple of times. And there's one of the things I most appreciated was, because I wondered how he would handle this, is what Goodman does with Kirk's brief retirement when he's and also all the politics with Kirk in the Admiralty is really interesting, and I wish somehow more of that, or some of that at all, could have actually been on screen, because he doesn't get along with the Admiralty, and there is and because he just doesn't like the desk job thing and thinks it's a mistake, and of course that's what he talks about to Picard about in Generations. And he says in this that he actually kind of manipulated things and threw an admiral way under the bus, really screwed this guy's career basically, in order to get the command back of the Enterprise with motion picture. And I also was really interested in the way that he screws Decker with that whole thing also, because he tries to get Decker that command, and then he decides to take it from him later, and it's a really horrible jerk face thing to do, and he feels bad about it. And but that's all really interesting. But also the way he deals with, so I was talking about the retirement during that period we hear about with Generations, when he's on the farm and he almost marries this woman, and she's got this dog named Butler and all of that, if you remember Generations. I wondered how exactly he would deal with that, because of course that would not have been his soulmate, and The book kind of suggests that Edith Keeler is sort of his soulmate, which I resisted at first, but it actually kind of works, and I like the parallels between her and Carol Marcus, and the whole Carol Marcus thing is wonderfully fleshed out, and he knows about David early on, which I didn't realize. And anyway, the whole thing with him and what's-her-face from Generations, I'm forgetting her name, all of a sudden, but she, Antonia, I think, she doesn't even know who Kirk is when they meet, and it's kind of just a fling for her, and he's ultimately just not in the place that he should be, and I think that was absolutely the right way to handle that. Lastly, a really important thing that it fleshes out is why Kirk hates Klingons so much, beyond just they killed his son, and the book really crafts all of that from a really early place. I think the book has got to be more enjoyable, and you'll get a lot more out of it if you really know your stuff, but I also think it reads pretty well just as a life history of a fictional character. So if you know anything about Kirk at all, I think a lot of the stories in this won't read as episode recaps. And to be fair, even if you really know your stuff, a lot of it doesn't just read as episode recaps because it adds enough new, organic material, and also extra, connective tissue, but also he never spends more than a couple of pages on an episode, with the exception of a couple, like Space Seed, maybe he spends a little bit more time on, and also, of course, Sitting on the Edge of Forever. But I think if you read this without knowing much TOS, I think you'd actually like TOS better, but I think it's got to be a better read if you are already pretty familiar with Star Trek and with Kirk's character. I highly recommend this. I think it's wonderful. The prose is pretty solid, and there are just a couple of little minor places where I kind of thought that Goodman went a little bit too far in kind of a self-indulgent place with references and things like that. But otherwise, I had a wonderful time with this book. I think it's great, and I think if you are a Star Trek fan, you should read it as well, and read, really, because otherwise we're all gonna die. Thanks for watching, folks.